Hello, everybody. This is Lisa Rehurick, and this is the RFP Success Show. As always, I am your host, and you are here to hear strategies and tips on how to make your RFP responses better. Today's guest is Faye Fulton, and Faye is a professional NSA speaker, author, and business storytelling consultant who specializes in helping businesses find, craft, and perfect their stories to grow their business or advance their career. So welcome, Faye. I'm excited that you're here.
Oh, I'm just so delighted to have you had me on, Lisa.
Wonderful. So, it's interesting. This is the third storytelling guest that I've had on the podcast. That's how important I think storytelling is. And it's really great to get different perspectives from different people. It's one of the reasons, Faye, that I wanted to have you on. And I know after every single one of the storytelling conversations that we have, I get questions. I get all sorts of people asking me questions. So I'm excited to give them even more content here around why storytelling is important. And there's so much applicability, which we're going to talk about. And people tend to shy away from thinking of applicability of stories in RFP responses because they think of them as technical documents, but there's so much applicability. So we're going to talk about that. So again, welcome. And I want to kick it off by having you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, I had an absolutely fantastic childhood
Nice.
because I grew up in Italy.
Oh, fun.
Yes, it was just marvelous. My father was a bigwig executive. He worked for Texaco, and he got this fantastic promotion. So before I was 6 years old, we moved to Italy. And I could not have had a better childhood. I was just so enamored with it. And I will always be a lot more Italian than I'm ever American because that's the world I came out in.
Right.
I just love it. I miss it to this day. I mean, I go back to visit as often as possible. But
Yeah.
growing up, what was so fantastic is I had two families. I had my American families. Now, I come from a family of three girls, but my parents are definitely white, Caucasian Americans. And what I mean is they're not touchy-feely, huggy. Very seldom did they talk about feelings or emotion.
Oh,
And I really craved that as a kid. I wanted the opposite. But I was so fortunate. I had my Italian family.
yeah.
And that was really just one woman. She was amazing. I've never met anyone else like her. It was a countess. Her name was Contessa Pignatelli. And she was a retired opera singer when I met her. She had retired for a few years, and when I met her, she was approaching 70 at a gallop. But she was a very famous opera singer in all of Europe. And after she retired, she acquired that disease where you're afraid to leave your home. So she
Oh,
never
yeah.
went outside. Agoraphobia, I think, is the correct term.
Yep. I think you're
But
right.
she never went outside. Now, she was often on her balcony, and she lived down on the third floor. Most people in European cities live in a high-rise apartment building, and that's
Right.
what we did. We were on one of the top floors, but she lived on the third floor. And that's how I met her. Well, this Contessa took me under her wing. She had never had children of her own, and we developed a very close, very special friendship. She treated me like I was her own. And because she never left her apartment, her friends came to her. Well, her friends were famous performers.
Nice.
So you can imagine the barrage of people I met as a child. I mean, it was
Wow.
sensational. And most of these people they were from all over the world, but most of them were performers, singers, actors, writers, musicians. Well, I was engulfed in story at a very early age. And
Wow.
these people are telling stories from all over the world, from different cultures, different beliefs, different religions. I mean, it was absolutely incredible. I was just amazed at it. I have always loved story. And Italians, they are fantastic storytellers. They
Right.
are people of emotion. They're very, very, magnanimous. They speak with their hands. And they're also very, very proud. Many of their stories are about their heritage, their lineage, but
Yeah.
also stories about what part of Italy they're from, the city. So they're always telling stories. So I had that from as far back as I can remember. So
That's
I'm
amazing.
just so passionate about story. But It was such an incredible childhood. But then in addition to that, the entire time we lived in Italy, which was quite a few years, we would vacation in the United States. So
Okay.
we would come to the United States and we would spend time with my grandparents, either my mother's parents or my father's parents. And the first time I met my Papaw, which was my father's mother, I was 8 years old. Well, of course, he had spent a lot of time with me when I was an infant. I didn't remember of any of that. So my first remembrance of him was when I was 8. He had worked in the refinery, but by then he had retired when I met him. So what Papaw did all day was he walked around with a notebook. And it was one of those notebooks that had a spiral at the top.
Yeah.
And all day long, he was writing stories.
Oh,
I mean, he was a refinery worker, but he was an incredibly creative person, unlike my parents. I was
got it.
enamored. So when he found out how much story meant to me, how much I loved it, Papa and I spent hours together writing his stories because his stories had a special little hitch to it. His stories had to rhyme. And that was
Oh, fun.
something that I had never been exposed to. I mean, we didn't even talk about rhyme in Italy. But Papa and I spent hours figuring out how to make these stories rhyme. And then at night, after we finished dinner, we were still around the dining table. Every night, Papa would read us the story he had written that day. And they were
Wow.
fabulous. Most of them were hilarious. So
What
working with
great
Papa
memories.
took my love of story to a whole different level.
And then how did you get it into kind of the business setting from there?
Well, here's the thing. I've been a professional speaker for over 22 years, and I've always worked in the field of communication.
Yep.
But now I have specialized. Now my niche when I'm giving a keynote speech or when I'm working with my clients is business storytelling. So it's an incredibly powerful communication tool. But that
Yeah.
is where I work today. I'm either giving a keynote speech and it's just a very informative speech about working strategically with story, or I'm working one-on-one as a business story consultant.
How
So that's,
interesting. Yeah, and I find it interesting because when we talk to businesses a lot, again, especially in the RFP world, people are like, "Well, there's no room in a proposal, in a response to an RFP for storytelling," and I completely disagree. Obviously, it's got to be tailored to that one, but tell us why it's important in business. Why is storytelling important?
well, here's the thing. I want to start by saying most people are exceedingly confused about story and
Yes.
storytelling. And I completely understand that because when they hear the word story, most people go back to their childhood. And
Yeah.
most children were put to sleep every night by listening to their parents read them a story. That's what they think of.
Yep.
But the thing is, unfortunately, right now, I've been working with story for over decades. But right now in the business arena, story and storytelling is a buzzword.
It is a buzzword. Yes.
Yes, I'll be working with it many years after it's a buzzword. It's my passion. But the thing is, we hear the word story very often, and people don't even know what story is. I'm amazed at what people are calling story today.
Hmm.
But the thing I say, unfortunately, because we hear the word story so often, but I like to start with telling people what story is not
Oh,
in the
good.
business world.
Okay, I love it.
Because, well, how many times have you come across this? You're either on a website or you meet someone and they say, okay, here's my story. I started my business in 2007 with my best friend Joe. Now we have over 250 employees and 2 locations. We have an
Right.
office in St. Louis and one in San Diego. And our annual sales are over 6 million, but we have plans. By the
Same.
year 2025, we're going to have 5 offices. We're going to open one in Singapore, we're going to open one in London, in Paris, Bangkok, and Madrid. And our sales are going to top 125 million. Well, that is not story. That's
Oh,
very far from being story. And that's what we call a data dump.
it is
No
a
one's going
data
to
dump. I love
remember
that.
your data dump. They don't care
No.
about all those facts and numbers and statistics. So I like to start in the business arena by telling people, all right, let's get focused, because here's what story is not. Story is not a list of bullet points. Story is not your mission statement. Story is not a report. Story is not a 1 or 2 line bio for every person on your team. That is not story. But I'll tell you, just most people are very, very confused.
Yes.
When I'm giving a keynote speech, I'll often ask them, please give me the definition of story. And, I'm in front of thousands of people. There are many hands that go up. And even when I'm working one-on-one with a CEO, a vice president, I'll ask them, well, what's your definition of story? And invariably, here's what I get. Story. Our story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Yeah. Well, yes, it does, but that doesn't help us understand story in any way. Even a cockroach and Thanksgiving dinner has a beginning, a middle, and an end. We're going to need a lot more information than that. But that's where I get. But a story is just an exceedingly underused business communication tool. Because most people I work with, they're power professionals. And they have this opinion of story, and they think story is nothing but fluff.
Yeah. Yep, I hear that a lot too. Kind of that well, we don't want to be too, they told us to leave out any extra information. And I'm like, yeah, this is not extra. This is, part of your response.
Yeah, you're like me. I hear that so often.
Yeah.
I'm like, no, I don't want a story. I want to share my numbers, my statistics, my facts. Well, I have to educate those people. I mean, this is my area of expertise. So I share with them, and it's always eye-opening. I share with them that your story is actually more important than your data.
Yeah.
Because the only way to understand data is within context. What are you comparing that data to? Whose data are you talking about? So your story is what allows your clients and your customers to understand. It gives the data the context. And so when I work with business storytelling, there's always an educational curve. But I love doing that. I love doing that because storytelling is such a powerful communication tool. So when they ask me my definition, when it comes to business storytelling, here's the definition I share. Storytelling is the intersection of your writing skills and your telling skills. Both are essential skills, but the magic happens when you become an expert at combining those skills. You're going to have to be strong in a lot of different areas if you want to be a good, great storyteller. So that's what I throw out, and it's like a challenge to them.
Yeah.
What I want you to think about is story is not fluff. It's going to take a heck of a lot of skills. So,
and when you talk to them about it, what, again, kind of back to the, what is the importance of it? Why do you find it so important to integrate stories into business?
All right, here's one of the reasons that storytelling is such a powerful communication tool. Stories are co-created. So when I'm telling you a story, as you're listening to that story, you are creating images of that story inside of your head. We all do it. And because my listeners, in the business world, it's going to be a potential client or maybe an existing client. As I'm telling my story, they are thoroughly engaged because they're co-creating. They're creating those images inside of their head.
Yeah.
All right, here's an example. What if I shared this with you? What if I said, she put on her crimson red lipstick, stepped into her black stiletto heels, selected the perfect hat for the occasion, strapped the kids into the backseat of the car, and drove off toward downtown. Now, were you just sitting there listening? No, because you were also creating those images of that woman in your head. What does that woman look like? What kind of hat was she wearing? Your story will never match my story. Your images inside of your head are unique to you.
Right.
So I was specifically talking about my oldest niece, who I love dearly. And that day, she put both of her daughters in the car to drive into downtown to see the Christmas decorations. And the hat she had on her head was a Christmas hat. I can almost guarantee you were not thinking about a Christmas hat. That wasn't
I had them in a convertible.
There you go. That is one of the reasons storytelling is so powerful. You've got an image in your head, and another reason story is so powerful, We remember stories.
We do. We remember visuals versus if you had just said, she got dressed and drove downtown. Totally
Yeah.
forgettable. Right?
So how powerful is that?
Yeah.
You are actually co-creating. You are part owner of that story. So it's amazing. But
And in
here's another
selling,
reason.
oh,
Yeah,
sorry, go
here's
ahead.
another reason stories are such important communication tools in business. Because people do business with people they like, trust, and know.
Yeah.
Well, when you're telling a business story, you're going to be able to get your clients and your customers to understand what type of person you are. Are you an honest person? Are you a person of integrity? Are you a person who keeps their word? Well, telling those kind of business stories is the fast track to trust.
Yeah.
In business today, it's about building those relationships. It's not about, in our crowded workplace, all those competitors. It's not about being heard above the noise. It's about creating trust. You can do that
Absolutely.
when you tell the right kind of business story.
Yeah, I love it too because I always tell my clients as well, like you've got to paint a picture so that they can get a feel for what it's going to be like to work with you. And that's exactly what a story does.
Yeah. So, over the past 10 years, there's been so much neurological research about storytelling. We've learned more about storytelling in the last 10 years than we ever knew before.
Yep.
And another incredible thing about stories is we are hardwired for stories. Our brains are.
Mm,
That is how we process data. That's how the brain works. So it's
interesting.
amazing because all of the information we take in through our senses, the information we take in through our eyes, through our ears, the brain will always try to make sense of information.
Yeah.
And the way the brain will understand, make sense, is through the structure of story.
Mm,
That's how powerful storytelling is. And something else that the neuroscience has found, and this is one of the core findings,
okay.
another reason to use storytelling in the business world: emotion trumps logic. Emotion will always trump logic. So how many times
Yeah.
have you heard someone say this? We buy because of emotion. And later, we justify that buying purchase through logic.
Yes.
So if you're trying to get your customers to buy from you, you're trying to sell. Those selling decisions, those choices are made on emotion.
Yeah.
Story includes emotion. That's one of the main components. And because of the emotion, the people will buy or the people will be moved to action.
Mm.
So how about that for reasons to use story in the business world?
In the business world and to sell, which is what we're doing in an RFP, right? And the hard thing too with an RFP is it's a written document and they don't necessarily know you. So they're forming opinions, they're forming judgments based on the first initial thing that they read. They're forming judgments on if you answered the question appropriately. So how wonderful to be able to then draw them back in if they've made a negative judgment on you because of something silly. Draw them back in with that story and get that emotion built up again, and you're building that trust. So I love it.
I
Now,
mean,
one of the
isn't
oh,
that
go ahead.
true?
Yeah.
Here's a question I'd like to throw out for those business professionals who want to just share their data. Here's what I always ask. When you share your data with your client, your customer, is that data going to make you more likable, more believable, more trustworthy? No, it is not. But what is going to do that? A story.
A story. Absolutely. Now, when you and I talked the initial time in setting this up, you talked about there being different types of stories. So what can you tell us about the different types of stories?
Definitely. Many, many types of stories. And of course, today we're talking exclusively about business storytelling,
Yeah,
not storytelling for entertainment purposes.
correct.
So there are 5 types of
Oh,
stories professionals need to be sharing. So you want to be sharing origin stories.
mm,
And by that, what I mean, the origin of your business or your career. Why did you choose to work in the industry you decided to work inside of? And those origin stories are going to persuade your clients and your investors that your organization or your business is worth it. So origin stories, definitely. You also want to be sharing beginning stories. And what I mean by that is your childhood stories.
Oh, so
All,
not the beginning of the business, but the beginning of you.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Your childhood, all of those life lessons you got while you were growing up. And that's what they were, life lessons.
Yeah.
Because again, when you start to tell your beginning stories, you're going to be able to convey to your customers and clients the type of person you are. And it's not going to be a story about business. Maybe you and your brother and sister were out playing baseball one day and your brother hit the ball and it broke a window. And your brother didn't fess up, but you're the person who went in, knocked on that neighbor's door and said, "I'm so sorry, I'll pay for your window. Here's what happened." It shows, are you a person are you honest? Do you have integrity? So those kind of stories, those life lessons. All right, so another type of story you want to be sharing, inspiring stories.
Yes.
Leaders today need to tell inspiring stories, and it's going to rally your team around a common cause. And people today want to be working on teams of like-minded people. They want to feel like they're part of something larger than themselves.
Yep. That mission focused. Yep.
Right. But when a leader tells those inspiring stories, today people want to know their purpose. Does their job have meaning? And that is so valuable today.
Huge, especially with the younger generations. Yep.
Millennials, yeah.
Yes.
They want a job with purpose. They want to contribute. They want to know they have meaning. So
Yeah.
it's huge, yeah. Or another type of story you want to be telling is the value story.
Yes.
And of course, these are stories to convince your client, your customer, that they need the product or the service you offer. Now, when we're talking about value stories, I'm not suggesting to anyone tell a story about one of your products. That gets in the salesy range. No one wants to listen to someone who's salesy today. That's not what we do with story. That's not going to be a good way to work with story. What I mean when I say value story is you're going to tell a story about a person who has used one of your products or your services
Love
and
it.
how it changed or improved that person's life.
Beautiful.
That again, I mean, Lisa, look, that's the emotion.
Yes.
How did it actually improve that person's life? Now you go on and on and on about your product. No, big turnoff. Yeah, that's not it. All right, the fifth
Love
kind of
that
story.
one. That's my favorite.
The fifth
for the
kind
line
of
of work that I'm doing, right? Definitely we need to be adding more of that into RFPs. All of it, but the value piece is huge.
Oh, I think so too. Yeah. But all right, so the fifth type of story that you definitely want to be telling are customer stories. And some people will think of those as testimonial. But testimonial doesn't contain all the story components. So what I'm saying is these are not stories that you tell. The customer stories will be stories your customer tells about how that product or service helped them or changed their life. Again, not on and on and on. I love the smell of your perfume. No. What's the value of what they got from your product or your service?
Got it.
Yeah. So it is just such an amazing tool.
That's great. So five, let's repeat the five again. So the first one was
the origin story.
Origin story, then background.
Beginning stories.
Or beginning. Okay.
Background.
What was the third one?
Inspiring stories.
Inspiring stories, then the value stories.
And the customer stories.
Beautiful. I love it. So for our listeners, well, a couple questions actually. The first one is, what do people struggle most with when it comes to storytelling?
Well, what I see people do is they struggle right out of the gate.
Yeah.
They struggle because they think stories. I don't have any stories. Invariably, that's what I hear. I don't have any stories. And I understand that vantage point, because to you, it's just life. You don't see it as a story, something that happened to you. But of course, everybody has stories and we all go through struggles. But when you're thinking, okay, I don't have any stories, well, I always encourage the people I work with to go through exercises with me
Okay.
because they have a lot of trouble finding stories or bringing stories to the forefront of their memory, because we all have tons of stories. So I'll ask them to think about beginnings or changes. There are always stories at those kind of junctures.
Okay.
So what I'm saying, think about leaving home for the first time. You began your college career. That's a big transition. Or think about the first time you broke up with a boyfriend. That was a big change. Or think about a move, the time you moved from Arizona to Philadelphia. That's a huge transition. Excuse me. And there are definitely going to be some stories there. You're just not thinking about it. So I
Yeah,
go
the other
through a
thing,
series of exercises.
don't you find too, like for me, I know this is where I get stuck, is that I'm like, okay, well, I've got these stories, but A, they're boring, or B, I don't see at all how this could relate to this RFP that I'm responding to right now, right?
Oh my God, woman, that is so true. Because in the business world, especially, it has to be story worthy.
Yes. Yes.
Some stories are just not interesting and they're not worth repeating.
Yep. And it's got to be relevant, right? To the whatever the business at hand is that we're talking about.
Absolutely. Because if it's not, you're not using stories strategically. And that's what you've got to do in the
Yeah.
business world. So, yeah, it's got to be story worthy. And just
So for
sometimes we have to really go deep to find a good story, but it's there.
So for the people that are listening that are like, okay, they're RFP responders, they tend to get very tactical and logical in their responses. Where do you think the best place for them to start would be? Would that be, think about the customer stories or the value stories? Because those are the two that kind of popped out to me as being something that could really add a lot of value in a written sales proposal.
Well, when people are starting with business storytelling, here's what I will definitely recommend when they're beginning: focus and work on your writing skills.
Okay.
That's where you would start. Crafting a story is a critical skill,
Yes.
and it is not easy.
No.
It is very difficult to write a story, a good story. And that goes back to the confusion people have, because people think they understand story until they try to write one.
Yeah.
And then they're in that overwhelmed spot. I mean, you've been there. It just
Yes.
completely, it's a bad place to be. You're
Yeah.
thinking, okay, what do I do next? Whose voice do I need to tell this story? I mean, there's just so many components. But you've got to work on those writing skills, because your story has to be a very, very skillfully crafted story. You've got to keep your listeners with you from the beginning to the end.
Yes. Very good.
And
I love it.
again, it takes a lot of different skills, not just writing skills, but you want to be using precise language and wonderful phrasing. All right, here's an example.
Okay.
I could say, I'm a woman, or I could say, I'm a female, or I could say, I'm a lady, or I could say, I'm a middle-aged woman with raging hormones, constantly seeking chocolate. Now, which one do you think is going to catch your listener's ear and they're going to want to learn more? And you're going to work on those writing skills. You've got to engage those listeners.
Plus, doesn't story also give you that instant, or I guess not for everybody, but such a potential for relatability?
Definitely. Definitely. In fact, that's my tagline for my business. And
Oh,
it took
okay.
me a while to come up with it, but I'm so proud of it.
Nice.
So that's what another thing I always share. So what you want to do is move beyond content to connection.
Mm,
And that's what happens with
yeah,
the storytelling.
beautiful. Well, we know
And
how
so
hard it
often,
is with RFP responses. It's hard to connect because again, they're reading a document, they're reading 2 or 3 or 5 or 7 other responses as well. And it's really important, if you want to stand out, you've got to make that connection. So I think this conversation about storytelling is so important. And before we conclude, one last tip or anything that you want to give to our listeners?
I would also want to share this with you. to work on your vocabulary.
Okay.
As a storyteller, you need a vivid vocabulary.
Mm,
And it's something that I find most people are lacking in.
yeah.
Now, here's an example. In your story, you could say, I lost my self-confidence. Or you could say, my self-confidence showed up dusty and moth-eaten. Now, when was the last time you heard the words moth-eaten?
Right.
But
Right.
it's a huge difference, isn't it? So you
Yes.
want a very vivid vocabulary. So that's a tip I will definitely share.
Okay, perfect. And if our listeners want to get in touch with you and learn more about what you do or talk to you more, how can they reach out?
Well, you can certainly find me on LinkedIn, and you can go to my website, which is Faye, Faye, Fulton, like Robert Fulton in the steamboat. So it's fayefulton.com.
Okay.
And you can also follow me on Instagram, and that's Faye Fulton _speaker.
Oh, great. Okay.
And on Instagram, if you follow me on Instagram, I share a lot of information about storytelling and tips. And every
Great.
Tuesday on Instagram, I share a vocabulary word with my definition of the word, not the definition you'll find in the dictionary, which is another
Nice. I like that.
storytelling technique.
I like it. Well, I'm going to go follow you. And for everybody
Thank you.
listening, everybody listening will have all that information in the show notes. So if you missed it, don't worry, go to the show notes and it'll all be there. Faye, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to have you here. It's really fun to learn all about this.
I'm just delighted. Thank you for having me on, Lisa.
Yep, absolutely. And I actually can't wait to talk to you about you helping me with my stories in my book. We've already talked about that, but she'll be helping me probably with my stories. So
Terrific.
Thanks again for being here. And everybody, you've been listening to the RFP Success Show. Again, I'm your host, Lisa Rehurick, and we will see you back here next time.